Well, this is kind of a unique morning, Sunday morning at Sanctus Ranch, the Restoring Christian Culture podcast. This doesn't happen that often. It's coffee instead of whiskey. So, and typically we don't have this kind of knowledge around the table. So welcome, everyone.
Thanks for
We're
having
happy
us.
to have you.
Thank you, Dan.
Doctors, it was a great night. You guys gave great speeches last night. And Nick, we appreciate you being around and joining us as well. So we thought today would be a good opportunity to kind of recap what went on, what's new and exciting, and where the traditional movement's heading.
Yeah, it's a big topic, that's for sure. So, where are we headed, y'all? Where are we headed? That's the question. Do you guys have, I mean, it's a good actually icebreaker question. Like, we're a month and a half-ish into Leo's pontificate. Any initial thoughts, feelings, kind of ideas where things are headed at the moment? You know, it's kind of hard again to kind of predict, but any initial thoughts?
Well, I think that there's an almost universal feeling of relief just to have a different pope and one who seems so much more placid and so much more respectful. Almost every speech he's given has been either rock solid or quite decent. I mean, in terms of even just what he's saying, it's of a much higher quality than anything we saw in the past 12 years. Obviously, I don't think Pope Leo is writing everything, but he must have renewed the body of writers who are working for him because his documents sound more like Benedict XVI or John Paul II. He has already caused minor controversies because certain appointments he's made are not the appointments that, a traditionalist would have hoped for. But on the whole, I think that we can just be a little more relaxed now, and we don't have to fear. With Pope Francis, I think that people almost woke up wondering what fresh hell is there going to be today. I mean, that's really where it got to, and I just don't have that feeling at all. And all the priests, all the traditional priests, they just seem quite happy, And I have to imagine for a priest, praying when he's praying the canon. And he prays Unicum Papa Nostro every day. It's right in his face. Who is the Pope and what is this Pope doing? And it must be pleasant for them to say Unicum Papa Nostro Leone. Just like, oh, okay, we're in a different era. But on the other hand, I mean, we've seen some really savage steps taken by bishops during this early part of Leo's pontificate, as if they're trying either to provoke the Pope into making a hasty intervention prior to his own readiness to do it, hoping maybe to catch him off guard or flat-footed or something, or because they're actually just worried that he's going to start rolling back some of what Francis did, especially with Traditionis Custodes, and they want to get it on the books as quickly as possible that this is not the way it's going to be in my diocese. And in fact, if Pope Leo did restore something more like Ecclesia Dei, that is, if he really let the bishops call the shots, which is what Traditionis Custodes claimed to be doing but didn't actually do. Right. If he implemented something like that, then unfortunately I think we would see a kind of East Berlin, West Berlin situation all over the world. Some dioceses would bring the hammer down on the Latin Mass, others would let it flourish. It would be a very bizarre situation. So it's hard to say what the future holds, really.
Sure, yeah. What are your thoughts, Doctor?
Well, my perspective is a little different. I came to a different understanding about the papacy under Francis, and that is certainly the papacy and the Pope is critical to the Catholic faith for all kinds of reasons. So I don't have to go into all that, all right? But in another level, and I hope I can say this in the right way, he's kind of meaningless at one level in the sense that I've got Christ, I've got the sacraments, I've got the Mass. In my day-to-day life, it doesn't really matter what the Pope is doing or what kind of interviews he's giving or things like that. And if a Pope says things that are in continuity with the unchanging teaching of the Church, then I can be glad, and he can have given me new insights for my spiritual life, and I'm grateful for that. And if he says something that's not in continuity with the teaching of the Church, it doesn't have to change my personal spirituality and the way I live my daily life.
Sure.
That has to be his problem, not my problem. So I look at Leo, and I agree with everything that Peter said. I mean, we certainly hope that this is a period of respite. But in reality, his entire formation in his life has been post-conciliar. I think we have to be reserved in what our expectations might possibly be. I think at best it's going to be a truce or some situation of toleration, which would be great. It would just be great compared to what we've had. But I just, I just lower my expectations and keep my head down and do my job.
Sure.
Let other people worry about, trying to parse everything that the Pope has said and what it means.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And in fact, I received a lot of praise and blame for a decision I made that I announced on my Substack a few weeks ago, where I said, having laid out my hopes and fears and prayers for Leo XIV, I then said, I intend to not talk about the Pope very much because we need to move away from this hyper-papalist mentality where he becomes the Delphic oracle, he becomes the Mormon prophet. Every day we're wondering what's new, what new law will be handed down from Mount Sinai or whatever from the Vatican Hill, and it's just it's a very unhealthy way of leading a Catholic life. It seems like there are whole corners of the apologetics industry that consist of nothing more than just regurgitating and commenting on papal statements. I mean, when did that happen? We know it's something with modern media. It's something that began with the age of newspapers, Pius IX. I mean, this has been going on for at least 150 years, and it needs to be checked. It needs to be there needs to be a counterbalance back towards local Catholic life, lived with integrity, with the fullness of tradition. So much so that people have said we almost need to be more like the medieval peasant who doesn't know who the Pope is in Rome.
There were times people could live their entire life and not even know who the Pope was.
Yes,
and it didn't matter because the faith was constant and the practice was constant, and
exactly,
and the expectation would be that the Pope would preserve that.
Yeah. Right, and there's one really amusing document that I saw somebody shared online, an excerpt from a letter that Blessed Junipero Serra wrote. I think this would have been the late 18th century. And he writes in this letter, presumably back home, he says, "We are starved for news. Please tell us everything you can, but especially tell us who the Pope is, because for the last year and a half, we haven't known whom to mention in the canon." And I'm thinking, it really was true that in California back then, they had no idea.
Right.
So,
and it didn't matter.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I think that what we'll have to consider is the reality that, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we've kind of turned into a global village. I don't like it because I feel, as someone who comes from small town Texas, that the outside world likes to corral us in and then take Texas apart one piece at a time until we're no longer Texas. Same thing with the United States, just becoming a multicultural place. It's not something that's very, very, I guess not just amusing, but good. But Leo will be interesting, I think, in this way. Young people are looking for clarity on social issues, especially growing up in the midst of the early 2010s, seeing, particularly in 2014, the rise of homosexual supposed marriage, as well as that's when wokeism really kicks off, is in 2014, 2015. All of these young people have grown up in that world. So it's like they're used to going to a public school where there's pride flags. They're used to being told all kinds of crazy things. So therefore, you're starting to see this resurgence and interest in Catholicism and also in other kind of just traditional forms of little r religion. And what will be interesting to see is how the Pope responds to it. So I think he could respond maybe in the ways that the popes have in the past. So kind of these just... let's say positive platitudes, be good to your neighbor, this, that, and the other, which that's not bad, of course, in and of itself, right? We should be good to our neighbor, but we should get more into the substance of what does it mean to be good to our neighbor? All of the commandments themselves in some form or fashion, right, are loving God and loving neighbor. And it'll be interesting to see how he pushes forward with that, because since he is on Twitter, right, and he had a life on Twitter before becoming Pope, I know that he's not ignorant of the social trends in both the faith and in Western society. And so, especially with the Catholic faith, you have basically two, at least in America anyway, two major strands. On the one hand, you have all of us, right, the traditional movement that's growing and increasing and fighting for survival. And then you have what I mentioned last night at our table, which is this really weird amalgamation of, on the one hand, individuals who are politically extremely conservative, like pre-1920s conservatism, but yet at the same time, I think that because they're ill-informed, they love the new Mass, they loved Pope Francis, and this came from, I think, more so than anything else, naivete. Because most of these people were 17, 18 years old, had been in RCA for a week, and were already lecturing cradle Catholics about how they were in schism for criticizing Pope Francis. So it'll be interesting to see how the Pope handles this. But I do think his first main challenge that he's going to have to overcome is going to have to be the Mass issue. Even if it is just a ceasefire in the sense of, hey, guys, let the bishops decide. This has become uncomfortable for many. Ideally, it'd be nice to see a return to the Summorum days.
Yes.
Right? That would be the best situation. Maybe even the better situation would be just, hey, not only just the Summorum days, but let's codify this in some type of more formal way to where this can't be opened up again. Just kind of end the debate once and for all.
I think personally that Benedict XVI intended to end the debate permanently, and I actually believe he did. I agree with John Lamont, the Canadian dogmatic theologian, that the central assertion of Benedict XVI, which wasn't in the motu proprio but was in the letter that accompanied it, that what was sacred in the past remains sacred and great today, cannot be abolished or considered dangerous, this whole language, that this is a dogmatic fact. He's not saying this is my opinion, this is my current canonical decision, but this is simply the way things are. The old rite was not abrogated because it cannot be abrogated. And even Paul VI, who was asked to abrogate the old rite, actually, I don't think it was Paul VI who was asked to do it, but Bernini asked the Congregation for Divine Worship to officially state that the Missal of Pius V had been abrogated because there were so many doubts in the early 70s over this question. And they refused. They said this would cast dishonor on many centuries of church tradition. We will not say that the old Missal is abrogated. So it never was, and it cannot be, and it will not be. And so this is why it remains true today that every single priest of the Roman Rite has the permission, because of his ordination, to celebrate the traditional Mass. The only thing that could arguably be controlled is the public celebration of the sacraments. So a bishop does have a legitimate concern in saying when and where you say Mass, what is your assignment? If you're assigned here, you need to do Mass in Spanish or whatever it might be. So I'm not saying that the priest is simply a free agent who can decide everything, but in terms of, may I say this old Mass? Yes, of course you may. And if you're a priest who's stuck in a situation where you need to do the Novus Ordo throughout the week, at least on your day off, you can certainly celebrate a private Mass according to the old Missal. Nobody can stop you from doing that. And if a bishop says, I don't give you permission, I don't give you faculties, he's just making that up from thin air. There is no such thing.
Yeah, I want to follow on that just a little bit, Peter, because you're right. A priest by ordination has faculties to say Mass, period. And the bishop has not only the right, but the responsibility to regulate liturgical practice in his diocese. But if you have an approved rite of the church and a priest has faculties to say Mass publicly in the diocese, does the bishop really have the authority to say, well, you can say this approved rite, but you can't say that approved rite? It's sort of like in the Novus Ordo, there are lots of options of different things, right? So you have 3 penitential rites. They're all approved. Can the bishop actually say, you can only use penitential rite A, you are not permitted to use penitential rite B or C? I'm not sure that that's a proper use of his authority. I mean, yes. I'm not an expert in the matter, but But it seems to me if you have approval to say public mass, then you have approval to say the old mass publicly. Now, to clarify that, the bishop can certainly say, we need Novus Ordo masses in this parish, and I want Novus Ordo masses said because that's the need of my diocese, and so on and so forth. So there's certainly amount of regulation in terms of what's offered where to serve the needs of his people.
Yes.
But if a priest says, "Look, I want to say the TLM Sunday afternoon at 3:00 and make it a public mass," does the bishop really have the proper authority to say, "No, you can't do that"?
It's an excellent question, and I think that it's actually an area of some grayness, in my opinion, in terms of where the line is drawn for what the bishop can control and what he can't control. And this is a very hot topic right now because of Bishop Martin in Charlotte, who, when his 20-page draft document was circulated, was leaked. And that was, by the way, I think that was fantastic. What a phenomenal strategic strike that was against a bishop who was about to do something insane. And he may still do something insane because that seems to be the kind of bishop he is. But his 20-page document micromanaged the Novus Ordo, including provisions that were simply contrary to the general instruction of the Roman Missal, contrary to Vatican documents. He was going rogue. He was just shooting down any expression of tradition or reverence in the diocese, even ones that were completely legitimate and even required in some cases. And so, I mean, to take the most obvious example, a priest facing eastwards ad orientem is built into the new missal. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that, but all you have to do is look online. There are tons of articles about this. There's one called The Normativity of Ad Orientem Worship According to the Ordinary Form from 10 years ago or something. And it goes through, it's got photographs of the missal, where it says, the priest turns around and says to the people, "The Lord be with you." It's like, well, what is he? Is he spinning like a pirouette? I mean, what's going on here? Obviously, it's because he's facing east and he has to turn around to say that. So, one question would be, could a bishop, because he's the chief liturgist of the diocese, responsible for the liturgical life, et cetera, all the language of these documents, could he say to the priests, I forbid you to celebrate Mass ad orientem"? Can he do that? My opinion is absolutely not. And the Vatican has even weighed in on this and said, no, the bishop can't go against the other more universal disciplinary decisions and rulings. So that's one type of question. Can he do that? No, he can't. Can a priest say, I'm going to do all of my Novus Ordo masses in Latin because I think that will be unifying for my multilinguistic, multi-ethnic parish? Can the bishop say, no, I don't allow you to do it in Latin. It has to be one in English, one in Spanish, and then I'll get you a Vietnamese priest for the third one or something like that. Again, I don't think he can do that, but bishops seem to be allowed, at least maybe this is an abuse, but they seem to be allowed to dictate those kinds of policies. And I don't really know where is the line, because certainly a bishop can say to a priest, I'm assigning you to this Hispanic parish because I want you to minister to them in Spanish. He can do that. And I don't think anybody would argue that that's not a legitimate request for a bishop, right? So it's, and then as far as getting to the Latin Mass, or the traditional Latin Mass, it kind of depends on how you view, is the old rite a separate rite? I think it is. I think the old rite and the new rite are two different rites. I don't think they're just two forms or two uses of the same rite. And I mean, even what that means would be confusing to say. If they're two different rites, it's almost, Pope Francis himself compared it to a bi-ritual priest, or a priest with bi-ritual faculties. In a case like that, if you're really talking about two rites, then I think a bishop would certainly have some kind of say over which rite the priest uses. Another way of looking at it would be to say, there are different liturgical books. There are completely different liturgical books, as you know. And can a bishop say, well, I want you to use these liturgical books in my diocese or at this parish? And it would be hard to say that he doesn't have some say over that matter. So I find it actually a fascinating and kind of confusing area.
I don't think that. I agree with you entirely that they're different rites, and that would be an interesting discussion in itself. They are not the same rite. Francis himself, God bless him, he was he was the first pope who was at least honest enough to say, they're theologically incompatible. Right?
Yeah.
You can't. So they are different rites. But we have a unique situation in the Latin Church, and that we have two rites. That doesn't exist in other rites of the Church. We have two rites. So I'm not so sure that if a priest has faculties, he happens to exist in a bifurcated church that has two rites. If he has public faculties, I'm not so sure he can be given faculties to do one rite and not the other. They're both the Latin rite.
Yes. Yes, and in fact, this is the whole point of Summorum Pontificum, was however you parse or however you might wish to defend Benedict's language of two forms, which he coined. It was a unique conceptualization to deal with a unique situation. What he was trying to get at practically was, you're a priest of the Latin Rite. Both of these liturgical books are available to you for use, right? According to your pastoral discretion, according to the requests and needs of the faithful, etc. It was a truly pastoral approach. It was very pragmatic.
And I always thought that was sort of for lack of a better use, political language, that he did not want to say there are two rites. Exactly. Because he didn't want to charge the argument that bishops would have this control to over separate rites separately.
Yes.
He didn't want to get that debate going.
Right. Well, as my friend Gregory de Pippo pointed out, if Pope Benedict had said there are two different rites, he would have been overnight granting by ritual faculties to tens of thousands of priests, and that's unprecedented. That's never happened before. So he was trying to find a way to shoehorn the two of them into one rite.
Right. Well, and I'm kind of curious now, as we talk about this is a lot about the priest and what can he do, but what about the faithful? We brought that up. We're all lay people. And so what does the faithful do with this? If there's confusion and challenges for the priest, what about the faithful that are just saying, wait, no, I believe that this is what's going to nourish the souls of my family. I've got to go find it. But they're up against just incredible direct persecution and then gang warfare. It's almost like mob warfare out there to go, oh, you can't do this or you can't do that. I'd love to have some thoughts on what do the faithful do?
Sure. Yeah, I think it kind of comes down to a couple of questions that you'd have to ask yourself, and ask yourself especially if you are a parent, which is, you can ask the basic question, do I want my children and my family and myself to have the best chance of making it to heaven? And we know from your talk last night, it was phenomenal going over the statistics, that statistically speaking, your best shot is going to be in the traditional world. That's an objective fact, just like, the sky's above us, right? That it's just an objectable fact. That being the case, that oftentimes requires a lot of sacrifice. And sacrifice is part of our theology. Suffering is part of our theology. I just remember last week when we were doing the Ignatian retreat, Father Asher just kind of beating into the guys' heads the mentality of suffering is here, it's part of this world, but learning how to deal with suffering and unite that to Christ is what can truly sanctify a soul. That suffering doesn't have to be maybe an extreme example that we think of, someone dying of cancer, someone who's in a ditch wounded or something. It could be that, of course. But for most people, it can be something like, I have to drive 2 hours on Sunday, in order to go to Mass and take my kids there. I have to maybe relocate and move to a place that has the traditional Mass in a traditional school that's available. I need to think of those things. If, for instance, you're a parent, the way I think about it is you have the fourth commandment, right? And we think of oftentimes the fourth commandment in terms of children obeying their parents and showing them honor. But there's a lot in moral theology of the parent that is required of raising up his children. And so things like, it is listed under every single moral theology textbook that public school is a sin against the first commandment, a sin against the virtue of faith. Outside of it, an extremely grave cause, and even in that grave cause, you need to basically be balancing out their Catholic education. How often is that happening? How many priests in the new Mass world are saying even this once a month or once a year or once a decade from their pulpits, hey, don't send your children to public school. It's completely rare.
Well, it's actually the opposite right now. They're saying,
Yeah.
no. We're going to rent to a public school, and you should send all your kids there.
Exactly. And
That's what we're getting from
And
the shepherds.
we'll take down the crucifixes and the images of Our Lady. So my point is mostly you have to recognize, like, okay, if I'm made to know, love, and serve God, that is the reason I'm on this planet. And if I have children and I want them to know, love, and serve God, and I'm going to be judged based off of how well I formed them to the best of my ability, then my advice is you need to be willing to, I think, to use your language from last night, be willing to give sacrificially. And that can mean things like, for instance, for myself, I'll give an example. It's easy for me because I'm single and I don't have kids. But for me, it's things like, okay, well, if I want my future children, my future wife, and myself to be in a good place, that means I need to go and live near a priory, near like a society priory or something like that, or near a fraternity parish or an institute parish or something to that effect. At least with the society, they have, full school there, so I can send my children to school. If it's in St. Mary's, Kansas, I can send them to school, and then I can send them to college. It's a great formation. Maybe that's not you out there listening, right? But maybe what you can do is you can do things like take your children to Mass as frequently as possible. You can definitely sit down every single day or a couple times a week and teach them out of the traditional catechism. You can definitely ward off bad entertainment from coming into the house. That's a major, major, major one. Things like that, right? Being very, very practical, finding other good community. The ideal, of course, is to, I think, move and go to a place, or if you have the means and a lot of people establishing something. But it's oftentimes just the little day-to-day things that can make a huge difference, I think. And so that's what the lay people should do. And the last thing I'll say is, don't fall into this mentality of thinking, falling into, let's just say, a non-Catholic form of obedience that you've talked about, where it's essentially, again, I'm a newish convert. I'm 6 years into the church. But the way I viewed this kind of hyper-papalist form of obedience was very cult-like. It kind of reminded me a little bit of Jim Jones. It was, let's turn off the intellect. Only the Pope has the intellect. Everybody else, I guess, doesn't have that faculty.
Like Averroes, agent intellect for all humanity.
Exactly. And it's just like everyone doesn't have it. We can only understand him through a handful of YouTubers. And then we just try to live our Catholic life, even if that Catholic life means that if the Pope came out tomorrow and said, no one can be praying the rosary. Okay, well, I guess we have to obey, no one can, you can't read the Bible for more than 5 minutes, Oh, I guess we have to obey. It's like, no, that's ludicrous. Of course, those are extreme examples, but it pulls out the idea to the point where you can recognize, okay, legitimate obedience is to conform you to the religion of Christ, the once and for all given religion of Christ. A false obedience is making you obey something that doesn't land that.
But I want to stay on this for a bit because I think this is a really key issue. I know it in my own personal life, and I think I mentioned this to you when we make a decision not to obey something, even if it's well-founded and it's the right thing to do, it should hurt.
Absolutely.
Right? Obedience is a really primary virtue that we have to foster. And in this day and age of everything being personal and relative, it's very hard to discern properly you can read the books and you can do this, but it's hard because if your leadership is not, you can't count on your leadership. There should always be this tugging about, well, is this me? I mean, that should always be bothering you a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, Peter, you mentioned about, bishops kind of abusing their authority and just being allowed to just sort of do anything. And people rightfully should be hesitant. I'm not saying they shouldn't challenge them, but they should be hesitant to do that. Pope Francis, I think this is why he wasn't, for lack of a better word, he wasn't taken down, right? I mean, the dubia came out and there were theologians that offered this, but no one ever made a definitive statement, if that could even be done, right? A definitive statement or something saying, this is heretical, you're wrong, there was a lot of care because of our respect for obedience for proper authority. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a huge issue because a parent looks at the carnage and says, "Look, my judgment day. I'm going to be asked if I fostered the faith in my children. How did I do that?"
Yes.
And so a parent has to make that decision. And yes, on the one level, it's, you can say, well, look, just look at the numbers. If I subject my kids to a Novus Ordo Mass, I'm threatening their faith, and I can't do that in good conscience. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not that hard of a decision to make intellectually. But spiritually, emotionally, every one of those decisions should be really hard. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a key problem or challenge for Catholics. The whole thing around challenged priests and the SSPX, which should not be an issue at all. Rome has just diffused that issue, but people still are told, right? They're told falsehoods. Well, they're not juridic or irregular. You really can't go to those masses. And I understand why people struggle with that, because they don't want decisions about the faith to just be personal and relative.
Sure. I mean, I think that the only reason why we can have this conversation is because the church is in a state of massive crisis.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I have defended many times the claim that the church is passing through the worst crisis of her history right now in modern times. It's hard to say how long this crisis has lasted for, but at least it grew up with the modernist crisis of the late 19th century, early 20th century. It kind of went underground during Pius XII. It burst out again in the 1960s and 70s. And I think, we've been sort of breathing in this almost toxic air ever since then with as you put it, rival gangs of all different sorts. And it's the worst crisis because it's the most subtle and the most chaotic. It's not about one particular dogmatic issue. Like, it's not about the divinity of Christ. That admits a yes or no answer. Although some of the semi-Arians tried to say maybe, but most of the great dogmatic controversies the lines were pretty clearly drawn.
Yes.
Now there are so many vague and squiggly lines all over the place in morals, in doctrine, in liturgy, especially, where even the concept of tradition, that we should cling to what is received and approved by the church over all the centuries of the practice of the faith, even that is called into question. It's a kind of, I think of it as a primordial heresy that is prior to all particular heresies. That's actually the way Pius X talks about modernism. Mm-hmm. But the primordial heresy of calling into question the transmission of the tradition, right, as such, the value of tradition as such, as normative for us and not as something over which we stand in superior judgment, which is unfortunately the way that popes and bishops have been about aspects of tradition for decades now. So
and the very challenge is that isn't coming from outsiders; it's coming from inside.
Exactly.
In fact,
Trojan horse in the city of God.
I went through the changes in the council. All right, so I was a teenager at that time, and I can tell you that we didn't question anything. Whether we liked it or not was irrelevant, right? Because we were raised to believe that the church would never lead us astray, and that what we liked and didn't like was kind of irrelevant. We had to give ourselves to the greater good, and so things just happened, and that could never happen today.
Yes. Well, and I mean, I think we have to bear in mind that in the 60s and 70s, millions of Catholics voted with their feet. The ones who were so shocked by the changes that they no longer recognized the same church. I mean, Frank Sheed even wrote a book called something like "Is It the Same Church?" And of course he, as an apologist, said yes, it is, and he tried to mollify people's feelings and so on. But a lot of people, I mean, I met people from that generation who said, I stopped going to Mass the moment the guitars came out, the moment the priest faced the people. I couldn't handle it. It was such a shock to me. I felt like the church had just lost her mind, or its mind. Yeah. And that,
Right, but see, even that decision, right, when you say, I'm going to leave the church, one might argue and say the church left me.
Yes.
Okay, but where are you going to go?
Right.
So
I'm not defending it.
Yeah.
I'm just pointing out that there were Catholics who accepted the changes because of an implicit trust in the institution and her leadership. And I think decades later, we can see how misplaced that trust was and how much better it would have been for the Catholics, I think, to have acted like the Catholics under Henry VIII in England when they did the famous March of the Five Wounds. You know, I mean, of course, they
we're
got
just thinking of
crushed.
that, yeah.
But I mean, the lay people rose up in revolt against what Henry VIII was doing, and against if you know the history better. Was it under Henry VIII that this took place? There's this famous document that Michael Davies loves to quote, where a bunch of lay people, they say, "We will have the Mass again in Latin." They're very, these are the supposedly ignorant, poor folk, uneducated folk. No, they knew what they were losing, and they fought against it.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of a funny story of one of the English martyrs. Don't remember their name, but it's in one of the large tomes that's been written about the English martyrs. And he's being executed. And one of these Anglican clerics comes up to him, and he's in front of all these people. He's about to be beheaded, and he says, "Look, just say the Our Father with me in English." And the guy looks at him, and he says, "God speaks Latin." Right? Those were his last words. I think what's interesting about it is that when we look at this whole situation of the crisis in the church, in talking about the subject of obedience, it's a good question just sometimes for people to ask the question, what is the object of obedience? What's the purpose of obedience? Because it's not an end unto itself. Mm-hmm. We don't just obey to obey. I mean, we want to obey because it's a virtue, right? We should submit our wills to what Christ has given us. That being the case, if it's being abused, or if Christ is being let's just say, veiled in some form or fashion in an inappropriate way, it becomes detrimental. It reminds me of all of our mutual friend, Tim Flanders. He has this photo that he sent me a long time ago of this church. I think it's in Michigan, where this was before the council, and they loved Pius XII just so much. But what they did is, in most traditional architectures, it's fairly common to see above the altar the Holy Ghost descending. They had gone and they had taken Pius XII and put him over the image of the Holy Ghost up above it. It was that kind of, let's just say, devotion, misplaced devotion. And, while it may not have been common in textbooks, it's funny, the manuals, they kind of get a bad rap, unfortunately, but they're not over hyper-papalist. They're fairly balanced in their approach. But then on the ground, when it came to the parishes, it was a nightmare. So yeah, I think asking that question for a lot of ordinary Catholics, just saying, okay, why am I supposed to obey?
Sure.
Why am I supposed to obey?
And I want to make sure that we talk about this too. You talked about people leaving after the council. I see it happening right now. We get these edicts. I can't tell you the last time I heard you shouldn't go to a Protestant church.
Yes.
I can't tell you the last time there was anything saying, no, this is absolutely false. But our church right now is allowing people to leave in droves, and no one's speaking to that. And I think that still is our challenge, because if we're going to be, extremely obedient to just this, but the church has got challenges, the layperson just leaving the church is the correct answer?
Yes.
That can't be.
Right. I mean, this brings up just the whole question of the problem with the church's approach in the past 50 or 60 years has been a continual preference for watering down commitments, for low commitment Catholicism. And the statistics show, sociologists have researched this, and what they've seen is that high commitment religion is what retains and attracts members. The church, in a sense, can never... If you're talking about the kind of people who only want religion for a little bit of comfort, maybe to their conscience or for fellowship or whatever, there's always going to be some Protestant group out there that's going to do that better than the Catholic Church. It's just like with the sort of pseudo pop style so-called sacred music, not really sacred music, where we can never compete with all of the secular music makers out there and with the Protestant bands and whatever. So if people are looking for that, they're always going to find it better outside the church. If they're in the Catholic Church, what we need to do is help their faith become deeper and deeper and more solid and more true and more full in every way. And we have 2,000 years of resources with which to do that.
Exactly. Yeah, I remember when I converted from the world of those, pop concert, rock and roll style evangelicalism. And coming into the church, I went to 3 new masses, and I walked away from it saying to myself, Lord, I know that this institution believes that you're present in the Eucharist, but I don't believe these people do. Based off of just, not just the way they were dressed and the way they behaved, but also, in fact, the music.
Yes.
Because it was so weird to me. I was like, you guys have 2,000 years of some of the greatest music that has ever been written on an objective level. Even if you're not Catholic, you can appreciate it. And yet you're using stuff we used, but not even the stuff we use now. The stuff we used in like 1990s and the early 2000s. Like I can tell you, your average new mass parish, when they're doing praise and worship, they're not doing praise and worship of today. They're doing praise and worship from like 20, 30 years ago.
They're backwardists.
They're very backwardist. So I'm sitting there like the lights are all on. It's this guy in like a short sleeve shirt playing a guitar up there. What's going on? Like recently, my friend Devin and I, we were in line for confession at this beautiful German church that's over in New Braunfels, Texas. Just glorious, beautiful German church. And we don't know what's going on because in front of us, I don't know if it's a wedding, a baptism, or a confirmation. I don't know what it is because I see children in confirmation clothes, but there's a baptismal font. But the priest is wearing wedding vestments. And it's all in Spanish, so I'm sitting there kind of confused, me and my friend being kind of the only Anglos in the room. And it's time for the presentation of the gifts, right? And what they end up doing is blasting music from a speaker. And it's so loud that us who are in line, I'm in tears trying not to laugh because it's so awkward. And it's some Spanish song. And I told Devin afterward, I said, silence is your friend in Mass. Like if you're a priest, even in the new Mass, you don't have to be saying things. You can be quiet. Of course, it more or less forces you in that world, but it's truly a tragedy. And that's why I do think that long term, you will see, as you pointed out in your statistics yesterday, you will see parishes continue to close. You will see people, as we online say, cope and seethe, right? Continue to dig their heels in and try to justify these things. You'll have that obstinacy. And I think the only time that will actually get serious is when we start to see some of the great churches in Europe start to really be handed over to the Muslims. Like I've theorized this. I don't know if this is true, but play along with me just for a second. What if hypothetically it got so bad, and they just kept digging their heels, it got so bad that the Vatican was bankrupt and they sold it and it became a mosque? Would then the popes wake up?
That sounds like a Robert Hugh Benson scenario.
Yeah, it's like, but you never know. I mean, this world it can be kind of crazy. You never know. And maybe then, they'll realize, hey, on the one hand, we're saying we need to join arm in arm with our brothers and sisters in Christ in the Protestant world and the Orthodox world. But those people that like the Latin Mass, they're the schismatics, they're the dissenters, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe then, hopefully, they'll come to their senses.
Peter, I want to jump back to something you said because I think it might be one of the key things of this whole conversation. It has to do with, what did you call it, a
High commitment.
High commitment religion. So in my own personal spiritual life, I always struggle, right? Is enough enough? What is enough, right? And unfortunately, when I think about that, I'm always taken to the Garden of Eden. Right, and so here's Christ, and he's looking at his Father, and he's kind of making up the conversation, but he's saying, "Look, I've healed the sick, I've cured illnesses, I've raised the dead, I've preached your word, I've done all these things." Right? I mean, isn't this enough? And he looks down at his only son, and he says, "No." He says, "I want it all." Right, and sorry. But that's what we're called to do. Mm-hmm. The truth is, enough is never enough.
Yes.
And I think that has to return. And when that returns, I think a lot of these things will solve themselves. Mm-hmm. It won't be about, is this bishop a jerk, or do I do this, or do I, when we can put ourselves in that place, I think things will change. And I think the challenge we have is that we are in such a materialistic world that it's really hard to figure out what enough is.
Yes, yes.
Right? We are so comfortable. Even in our poverty, we are so comfortable. And I just didn't want that to go, because I think that is really the key, that the Catholic Church, it's not a high commitment religion, it's a total commitment religion.
Yes, yes. I wanted to just return for a moment, but I'll also connect with that thought to the obedience question, just because I think we kind of left it hanging. And it seems to me that the best way to put the issue is to say that obedience is a major virtue, but it's subordinated to and in service of truth and charity. It's meant to attach us to the truth, to Christ himself, who is the truth, and all that the word truth contains. And I would put tradition there in that category as well. But also to preserve communion. So the charity and the truth, these are the two crucial, not that truth is a virtue, but adhering to the truth in love is what obedience is for. And therefore it's not an end in itself, and it has measures. It's a measured virtue. It's not a measureless virtue, something that you just sort of shoot at random towards any object, or what have you. And so then I'd also say, if obedience always is hierarchical, by which I mean, if you're going to disobey any particular command or policy or whatever, it has to be in service of a higher obedience. I'm obedient to something which trumps this lower policy or command, right?
Sure.
So not just like in an American free-for-all, I'm a rebel, I don't want to have anybody, to obey over me, a kind of non serviam attitude. That's, of course, extremely vicious, satanic. But I want to cling all the more tightly to the authority that is higher than this other authority that's telling me to do something that's wrong or something that's harmful to the common good or to my spiritual good or my family's good. So yeah, the hierarchy of obedience, I think, there is really crucial.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great conversation. And, maybe we'll kind of wrap up today. I know it's been good, but I'd just love to have your parting thoughts. We had a great conversation. There'll be a lot of the speeches that were given last night will come out. And so folks that are on our channel will have an opportunity to see those. But we've talked a lot about restoring a Christian culture. We've talked about the Mass. We've talked about, sacrificing all to be fully in. Any parting thoughts? If you're watching this right now and you're saying, hey, listen, what do I do today to restore Christian culture in my little world, my little domestic church? Love to have a highlight.
Yeah, I'd say for me, one thing that can easily be overlooked, I think, as we're going throughout these battles, is the battle that we're all called to, which is personal sanctification. And it's so easy, especially for us who enjoy intellectual conversation. It's so easy for us to miss sometimes the very simple truths of Christ that oftentimes are summed up in the phrase, be like Christ. Like we can hear be like Christ, and that can kind of roll off the back, if you will. But the whole purpose of Catholicism is to be conformed into the image of the Son, is to be, right, to practice the imitation of Christ. That's what we're called to be. And so my parting thoughts would be, in all of the decisions that you make, right, ask the Holy Ghost for grace and for guidance so that you can be better conformed to the person of Christ. And you can apply that standard to all of your life, everything from where do I send my kids to school, to how do I order my day, to what do I prioritize throughout my life. That's the core, and all of these things that we're talking about will naturally flow from that. But you have to keep that at the core, because oftentimes, I warn especially young guys, don't make the crisis your religion. If you know a ton of stuff about the crisis, great, cool, let's have a conversation. But If you can't tell me the commandments, and at worst, you're not living up to the commandments by his grace, that's what you need to focus on. It's not saying that the crisis isn't important. It is, and we need better material on it. We need to have better discussions on it, but it has to be subservient to the ultimate purpose of man's life, which is sainthood. Because if we're in heaven, right, which is our home, our final destination, that's the only thing that should matter.
Amen.
I agree with that. So I'm just going to go in a different direction.
Sure, yeah.
And I'm going to make the point that I think that Catholics need to work very hard calmly, but they still have to work hard to surround themselves with beauty in all forms: musical beauty, visual beauty, liturgical beauty, and not because of aestheticism, but because this is food for our souls, and this raises our minds and hearts to God. It's a balm for the spirit. We need this. God gave us beauty for a reason. Natural beauty, everybody acknowledges how wonderful the natural world is. Sunrises, sunsets, mountains, oceans. Everybody talks about this, animals and plants. But in the realm of culture, in the realm of the church and the liturgy, our modern Western world is unrelentingly ugly in some ways, right? I mean, the asphalt jungles and the skyscrapers, and just, people are kind of trapped in this man-made world of steel and concrete, and it's very... It has nothing transcendent about it, nothing theocentric about it. And so we actually, in our homes, we should take thought for, let's have beautiful works of art. Let's listen to good music. Let's make music together. Let's sing. Let's learn how to dance, real dances like English country dances and Virginia reel and waltzes and things like that. Let's try to rebuild a culture of beauty. And obviously in the church, in the Mass, most of all. I think I see this as almost a kind of countercultural, not a rebellion, but a restoration, of culture. That's exactly what you're asking about. So we have to take the beautiful very seriously. Yeah,
That's wonderful.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that, certainly challenge yourself at your level of commitment. In your pursuit of sanctification, what's holding you back? What is your level of commitment? But I would also say we have to seek out people with whom we can do this together. We are really a communion. The Catholic faith is a community, and I think one of the things that we struggle with the most, particularly when parents release their kids into society, they're just overwhelmed with this ugly, hedonistic, demonic society that just presses on them, and they cave when they don't have anybody to hang on to. And so I would say, not just make a personal commitment, but make the sacrifices that are necessary to connect yourself with other people who are willing to make the same levels of commitment, willing to make the same kinds of sacrifices, that you can support each other in doing that.
exactly.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. This has been an exceptional episode of the Restoring Christian Culture podcast, and I look forward to you all coming back and visiting us again soon.
This is a great place. It'd be great to come back.
Yes.
It'd be wonderful.
Thank
Always
you, Dan.
welcome. All right, take care, everyone. God bless.